Okay, welcome everyone to the first seminar of this term this year of our nature series. It's great to see so many. We had limited registrators online, so we thought we weren't quite sure what the turnout would be for the first seminar, but you managed to get a very full room. So congratulations. Before I hand over to my colleague Lisa to introduce our speaker, I'll just mention a few of the other seminars we've got lined up this term, all of them on Fridays. Next week we have Miguel Araujo, who's a distinguished global biogeographer, and he's going to be talking about embracing complexity to understand and predict the consequences of environmental changes on biodiversity. The week after, we have Eleanor Lazo-Chavero from the Autonomous University of Mexico on land tenure, deforestation, and monocultures, menaces to food and territorial justice. The week after, we have Miles Silman from Wake Forest University in North Carolina on the impacts of small-scale mining on tropical rainforests. Thank you. And then there's various others. I just mentioned one other as a highlight. On the 23rd of February, we have Tim Smith, the founder of the Eden Project, on the transformative art of kissing frogs. So do come along to all of those. There's the various other ones we're confirming in there as well. So now I'd like to hand over to Lisa to introduce our speaker, but also just to mention afterwards, we've got some drinks at the back and snacks. So do feel free to linger, informal conversations afterwards.
Great. Thanks, Uvinda. So I'm Lisa Wedding. I'm an associate professor here in the department, and I'm also academic director of BCM program. So great to see a lot of the BCM students here. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tundi Agardy. We are lucky to have her as a distinguished visiting fellow at Worcester College all term. And so Tundi, I also have the pleasure of working with Tundi on the editorial board of a new nature journal, Ocean Sustainability. So she's the founder of Sound Seas, which is a Washington-based, Washington, D.C.-based group working at the nexus of science and policy. And to focus on advancing marine conservation around the globe. And so in this particular role that she has, she assists NGOs, government agencies, and multilaterals with conservation planning and project implementation and program evaluation. So formerly, Dr. Agardy was a senior scientist at WWF, directing its marine work there. And then she later founded Conservation International's Global Marine Program. She received her PhD in biological sciences and master's in marine affairs from the University of Rhode Island in the US, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. So today, Tundi is going to be talking to us about restoration and conservation of coastal ecosystems. So let's give her a warm welcome and our attention.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Vinda, for the opportunity to speak. I have nowhere near as an exciting talk as Tim Smith's about kissing frogs, but I hope to be a little bit provocative today and talk about what's required to restore coastal and marine ecosystems around the world. See if I can advance this way. So the marine world is wondrous and full of life, teeming with life and biodiversity. And it's a place that all of us very much value, but it is a place that is being rapidly transformed all around the world. The transformation is occurring not just because of the way we use the sea, deployed its resources, transform coastal areas to develop them for our own use, but also the way that we deal with land and fresh water, because ultimately the oceans are the sink for everything we do on the planet. And much of the activity in watersheds will negatively affect coastal areas as much as the activities that we do at sea, such as fishing and mining. Oops, I'm being too eager with my thumb here. Against the backdrop of all of these pressures that we exert simultaneously and cumulatively on the sea, we have, of course, global climate change, which is causing sea level rise in some places, causing water to warm, causing increased incidence of storms, causing ocean acidification. So all of these things together have resulted in a situation where the oceans are no longer, in many places, that wondrous, beautiful, awe-inspiring place, but are places that are highly degraded, and places where we're seeing ecosystems approach points of no return, approach points where regime shifts can take place that are extremely difficult to recover from. At the same time, we're creating less and less space, providing less and less space for coastal communities that so depend on ocean resources to utilize those resources. So we're cramming people into smaller spaces with fewer resources, creating opportunities for conflict. You would think that because we live on a watery planet, that the oceans are so big that these impacts are minimal and aren't yet affecting the functioning of the processes that exist in marine and coastal systems. But unfortunately, that is not true. And the reason for that is that the coastal areas are the ones where there's the most cumulative pressures going on. And it's the coastal areas that are essentially the vital organs of the ocean system. So it's these coastal areas, particularly estuaries, where land meets the sea and where fresh water bridges the two, that are the most important ecologically in terms of keeping ocean ecosystems functioning. And these are the places where we're exerting the most pressures. As a result, we have a situation where we have a dangerous cycle that's leading to degradation and ultimately the diminishment of human well-being. And that in turn feeds more and more destruction and degradation. And so we're caught in this kind of endless feedback loop. Now, my point today is not to depress you. And I don't want to dwell on this too much in terms of what we're doing and what we've done and how insufficient our response has been. But I do want to make the point that the typical response to noticing and observing and experiencing degradation is for governments to continue to practice siloed management, sectorally addressing one problem at a time, or to do what I call conventional conservation, which is to essentially erect a fence around a marine area and hope for the best by restricting use. That leads to a deepening rift between coastal communities and people depending on ocean resources and the sea itself. Oops, sorry. And a continued loss of biodiversity and the ecosystem services that flow from healthy, productive ecosystems. Now, I am not saying that marine protected areas and other conventional conservation measures can't work. And in fact, they're extremely important, and they have been shown to increase biodiversity, to increase productivity, and even to cause spillover effects where neighboring adjacent areas are made more healthy and more productive. But this can only work in systems where ecosystem functioning hasn't been compromised. And unfortunately, what we have is a situation where many of our coastal areas are so degraded now that we can't turn to conventional conservation, what I call conventional conservation. We can stop, we can mitigate the destruction with conventional conservation, of course, and with active good management. But to reverse the tide of degradation, we really must practice multifaceted restoration at the scales appropriate to these enormous interconnected marine ecosystems. Oh, oops. I'm not mastering this technology very well. I apologize. I also want to apologize for setting up what's really a false dichotomy. I know many of you are conservationists, you practice conservation, and as part of your conservation work, you are doing restoration. And I don't want to imply that conservation and restoration are separate from one another. But I want to create this false dichotomy to make a point. And that is that if we want resilient coastal systems that are currently very degraded, we can't rely on conventional conservation tools alone, and we need to restore the health of these systems before we can turn to those tools to let nature recover itself. And here, when I say resilience, I'm talking about not just the ability to resist change, so to be healthy in the face of disruption, but also the ability to adapt, because as you know, ecosystems are changing very, very rapidly, not just because of climate change, but because of all kinds of large-scale environmental changes that are occurring. So when we want sustained recovery, we need to harness both the tools of conservation and the tools of restoration. Now, I know it sounds a little bit like hubris to be saying that we need to heavy-handedly step in and take over. And what I'm not implying whatsoever is that we have any ability or desire to control nature, but only that we take a look and first restore the environmental conditions that can let nature then thrive. Part of this can be attempting a kind of blue rewilding, so reintroducing species that have disappeared. But first and foremost, to understand what's led to the degradation and then tailor the solution to the problem that's at hand. And this may seem completely obvious and not worth even mentioning, but actually this kind of problem scoping is something that's very rarely done. And what happens is that planning agencies and management agencies will often reach for a solution before they even understand what the problem is. So in terms of trying to most efficiently and most effectively restore coastal ecosystems, there has to be an investment of time in understanding why did they degrade in the first place. And you might wonder, is this even possible? And I would say emphatically, it is possible. We do have a lot of knowledge, and this knowledge is not just scientific knowledge of our traditional sort, but also user knowledge. So traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. The knowledge base is ever growing. We still are very far behind terrestrial ecology in terms of understanding the ocean ecosystems, but we are building that knowledge base. We also have now a lot of experience in marine restoration. Admittedly, that experience are small scale projects, none really to the scale that we need yet, but we're building that experience and that knowledge base simultaneously. And we have a particularly opportune time right now. And that is because we have a lot of things going on simultaneously on the policy front that bear mentioning. We have a couple of UN decades of going on right now. One is the UN Decade of Restoration. The other is the UN Decade of Ocean Science. We have a brand new global biodiversity framework under the Kumming Montreal Agreement, under the Convention on Biological Diversity. This framework articulates a target specifically for restoration, as well as a target for protected areas and for sustainable use. We have a new agreement for high seas areas, that is areas beyond national jurisdiction, under the UN General Assembly, under UNCLOS, the UN Law of the Sea, which is called the BBNJ Agreement, Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. And that creates an opportunity to do conservation and restoration on the high seas. We have a lot of disaster risk reduction initiatives, and these are often not mentioned in the conservation arena, but these are super important in terms of utilizing and building up nature-based solutions. We've got all kinds of negotiations and agreements going around on plastics pollution, and that will in turn open the door to other kinds of agreements around other kinds of pollutants that might actually be even more important to tackle than plastics, like PFAS and other kinds of toxins that are affecting ecosystem function. We have also carbon and biodiversity markets, and these are expanding, and that's a subject for a whole nother talk. And then in brackets, I put the climate change negotiations. Of course, those are happening and are very important at the same time, but we have a lot of reason to think that there are frameworks in place and policies and targets and commitments that countries have made to reach those targets, which create opportunities for restoration all around the globe. Sorry. I seem to have decharged. Okay, this one's working now. So where does restoration fit into this? And let me just say that when we talk about restoration, we talk about, as you all know, because you are, many of you, restoration experts yourselves, we talk about active and passive restoration. So I think about active restoration as kind of jump starting natural recovery. And I think of that natural recovery as the passive restoration. What Isabella Tree in her Wilding book called the self-willed ecological processes. So letting those happen. But active restoration is often needed as a precursor to allowing the passive restoration to occur. We have a lot of small scale demonstrations projects. As I said, we have restoration experience, much of it small scale. Those small scale demonstration projects show what's possible, and they can be replicated and they can be expanded. So that there are opportunities in terms of on the ground opportunities, not just policy opportunities, but also site-based opportunities to get going on restoration at bigger scales. But really what we should be aiming for, and what a lot of these policies kind of imply and create an open door for, is to embed restoration in everything that we do. When we do coastal development, we should be thinking about how to do that development in such a way that it helps nature recover itself, that we do restoration as a part of development. When we think about doing marine spatial planning, we should be embedding restoration into that. So we should be identifying sites where we can invest the time and money to recover nature and to give it a kickstart for nature to recover herself. So I do want to mention also that restoration is a long game. It's not an immediate thing that reaps immediate rewards. And this is problematic for people looking for funding for restoration, because funders are often interested in seeing results in 3 to 5 year timeframes. Restoration is a long game. It means, first of all, changing the milieu of a particular site so that the environmental conditions are improved. That could be water quality, and it could be benthic conditions, all of the conditions. It can also mean actively building structures to allow the restoration to happen. And that's kind of the quite literal foundation for restoration in the marine environment. And then it also means actively restoring biota, including, where possible, rewilding. And that's, of course, the biodiversity component and the thing that we care about most. And then stepping back to let nature heal herself and undertake the long road to recovery. I'm going to just mention very, very quickly, I'm going to fly through this very quickly because I want to make sure we have time for questions. I'm going to tell you about 2 different examples from the Caribbean. Now, these are not examples that I would say are demonstrating best practices that can be applied everywhere. They're deliberately 2 very different examples to show you kind of different extremes of what I'm talking about when I say that active restoration is a way to kickstart natural recovery. So the first will be in Barbados. Both are from the Caribbean, both examples. Barbados in the Antilles. And the second example is from Mystique, which is in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we'll start with Barbados, the west coast of Barbados. The west coast of Barbados is an area where Barbados, which was once an agricultural area and a very important colony for Great Britain because of its rum production. Slowly over the past century has been transformed into largely a tourist economy. And the West Coast is an area with a lot of tourist resorts, as well as small towns and fishing villages and so forth. The problem marine problems in Barbados are many, but in this particular site, what was happening was an excessive loss of beach and shoreline erosion. And I just point to these three profiles from aerial photographs from 1950. This is a little bit deceptive because this looks like it's beach, but it's actually just resuspended sand. This is during the North Swells. So the beach is not as wide as it might look here with this white, but it was quite wide. You can see in 1991 how wide that beach is. And by 2015, there's almost no beach left. And you can see also the transformation of the land. So going from agricultural area to mixed agriculture and settlement to a massively redeveloped land with resorts and a lot of shoreline hardening also to the north. Along the entire West Coast, we see a pattern of loss of shoreline, so loss of beaches, inundation over time. And the consequences of that are, of course, there's less value to the beaches, which are very, very important for Barbados's economy. There's direct costs to the tourist operators, but very importantly, there's a loss of access for residents. And Barbadians do spend a lot of time on the beach, and it is culturally extremely important for them, and less access to the beach, again, crowding tourists primarily into the remaining beach pockets and excluding local residents from a lot of the areas, just by virtue of the fact that there's less beach available. Of course, decreased habitat for things like shorebirds and crustaceans and nesting sea turtles and so forth. Increased risk of inundation and flooding and damage to infrastructure. But not only that, but the increased inundation and flooding also means there's a lot more pollution getting onto the reef, because when waters flood, they then recede and they take with them all kinds of heavy metals from the roads, sewage, you know, you name it, plastics, even large debris. So really big problem for the reef ecosystems offshore, not just for the coastal floodplain. And that, of course, is leading to degradation of the nearshore reefs, and the degradation of the nearshore reefs then means more and more inundation, less ability for the reefs to buffer the land from storms and so forth. So to solve this problem, Baird and Associates, which is a Canadian engineering firm, which has had a long presence in Barbados and has worked in partnership with the Coastal Zone Management Unit, which is a government agency in charge of coastal management. Baird came in and did a lot of studies to understand what was causing the beach loss and the shoreline erosion, and to tailor a solution to that problem. So part of that involved LiDAR overflights, and then this more highly refined CODA mapping, which really gives you a three-dimensional mapping of the seafloor, where you can pick up individual coral colonies. Amazing technology, and very quickly done, and basis for a lot of different modeling that the engineers did. Baird was also looking at analyzing the tides, the 50-year storm surge, and sea level rise, as well as local sea level rise anomalies. And this is something that's a little bit strange, is that you have pockets in places where you have the standard sea level rise, which is caused by the seawater expanding from warming, but also subduction of the plate, right? So if the land is going down, the relative sea level is going up. But you also have anomalies, which are these bizarre little pockets in places where the water just seems to rise up. And this happens predictably year after year in certain places. So Baird was looking at that as well. Doing wave modeling to better understand waves and currents and storm surge. Doing sediment transport studies, because of course beaches are composed of sediment, and sediment has to be delivered to the beach in order for there to be a beach. And sediment can't be washed away from the beach if the beach is to be maintained. Also hydrological studies, because the hydrology, fresh water coming in, surface water as well as groundwater onto the reef is going to affect the stability of the shoreline, as well as the health of the reef. So we have drainages on this site, and we have also surface water runoff. Baird was able to look at all this and ascertain the reasons for the erosion of the beach, and then build a physical model to test the solutions to stopping the erosion of the beach. And these physical models are quite complex. They're done up in Canada. They involve taking the CODA data and creating a model. So really getting the coral reef and the bottom topography exactly right. And then testing out different structures to see what will hold the beach in place. This physical model actually had to be redesigned, because what we noticed right away when we were doing surveys is that the nearshore contained a lot of coral pavement, essentially. So dead coral, old coral reef, ancient reef that had been eroded out and had a lot of voids in it. So it's like Swiss cheese, or maybe, I don't know, maybe Havarti or some other kind of cheese with a lot of more smaller holes. Critically important as fish nursery habitat. And something that typically when people see ancient reef, dead reef, they kind of pass it by and they go on to the living reef, and that's where they do their biodiversity assessments, and that's where they concentrate their conservation. But actually these dead structures, these dead reefs now eroded out with all these voids, were inshore, and where they initially thought to put submerged breakwaters to hold the beach. And we said, nope, don't do that. Let's not get rid of the fish nursery habitat. It's a limiting factor for fish populations in Barbados. So let's keep that. And therefore, we move the structures farther offshore to avoid this dead reef area. Where the structures ended up getting placed, and these are submerged breakwaters, so they're not visible from the shore, and they're not an impediment to some kinds of navigation. I mean, you can windsurf over them, but you can't take a deep keeled boat anyway. But where these structures went in, there were a few small isolated coral heads. And those coral heads we moved and relocated to a nursery during construction, and then we brought them back and cemented them onto the breakwaters with a very high success rate, I'm pleased to say, and a lot of subsequent growth of those corals on the breakwaters. Something we're working with now is to assess the design of these submerged breakwaters so they maximize coral sediment and also coral survival for those relocated corals. And I'll talk about that in a second. So this is what the structure looks like. These are not the submerged ones. These are the submerged ones here and here. And these submerged breakwaters are holding this beach in. You can see how wide the beach is now, and how much beach is created. As I said, the breakwaters are designed in such a way so there are voids in the breakwater as well. It's not a solid breakwater on the bottom, but there's gaps in between, which are important for fish life. But also the planes of the rocks used are in such a way that it maximizes coral settlement. And so not only the corals that are been kind of pasted on there, cemented on there that were moved during the construction, but also new coral colonies are immediately started growing on these breakwaters. And with the idea and the hope that in a matter of just decades, the breakwaters will no longer be visible, and what will be there is a natural living reef with the support of these large boulders that are keeping the beach in place and doing that service artificially for the time being until the reef grows to the point where it can kind of take over and keep up with sea level rise. So we call this a green-gray approach, and it's the physical environment that kind of sets the stage for recovery. So the shoreline stabilized, that has the benefit of giving more space for turtles to nest, more habitat for shorebirds, but also less sedimentation on the reef. So there's less sand leaving the beach and going and smothering the reef. There's less pollutants coming in also because they also are lessened by the shoreline stabilization, and more nursery habitat. But I do want to mention that it's also creating an enabling environment for stewardship. Why? Because people inquire and learn about these structures. They learn about the process of natural recovery. So once nature has been assisted in this way, we step away and we watch with wonder as the corals come back, as the fish come and are attracted to the area, as the area provides even more habitat for young fish and increases the productivity. And that creates opportunities for stronger connection, whether it's tourists or residents, between humans and the sea. And also creates development opportunities for the community in Speightstown, which has been kind of left behind in Barbados's development. I just want to quickly mention another project in Barbados, because the problem here is a little bit different. And I just want to quickly mention, again, Baird was called in to look at a situation somewhat to the south in a place called Holetown, where there was also shoreline erosion, but a huge problem with water quality. And apologies for this picture being out of focus, but you can see the beach is coming in and has been lost to the point where there's infrastructure now dangling on the edge of the water. And this green strip here is a creek that comes in and brings fresh water down from the mountain. At times, Barbados has these enormous precipitation events, just heavy monsoonal rains during the rainy season. And when that happens, the high elevation waters come crashing down, bringing with them, of course, all kinds of pollutants and washing the sand away as the water flows through out to sea. So Baird created a few things here. Again, submerged breakwaters, the two that you see. And also on the right-hand side, something called a fluidizer, which is essentially a culvert built into the beach, which allows the drainage of that creek across the beach. But it also does something, it modulates the flow of water. So that's one thing. So the flow of water is kept within that kind of culvert and doesn't take all the beach away, all the sand away with it and dump it on the reef. But the other thing it does is that it filters the water coming from the creek before it reaches the ocean. And it filters it, just the sand itself acts as a filter to retain a lot of the heavy metals and pesticides and other pollutants that are that would be coming through and otherwise would be dumped on the reef. So the immediate effect of this was a great improvement in water quality in this localized area. And with the improvement of water quality and a lessening of the turbidity of the water, immediately these breakwaters started being colonized by corals. So you saw these small colonies coming every year and growing very, very quickly, even though these stony corals are not particularly fast growing, but see a lot of growth very, very quickly. These waters are pretty nutrient rich, and so it allowed for good growth in the absence of these chemical pollutants. But the other thing that we saw was an increase in diversity. So we saw the kind of regular corals you'd see encrusting brain corals, for instance, on the boulders, but also things like this Acropora palmata, which is the elkhorn coral, which pretty much had disappeared from Barbados in the 1980s, and coming in all over these two breakwaters and taking a foothold again. So great to see. And then along with, of course, the structures and the corals and the sponges, a lot of fish attracted to the breakwaters and reproducing there and using the breakwaters as a nursery habitat. So I'm going very quickly because I do want to leave time for questions and I want to get to the other example. Just want to say that I understand, and you must be thinking, Barbados is kind of unique. It is an interesting area that is an island that is highly, highly developed, urbanized, I would say. It's also a place that's unique for positive reasons in that there's a longstanding coastal zone management regulatory body, very well understood ecosystems. Baird has been working there for almost 2 decades now and doing long-term monitoring. And one thing that Baird does, in contrast to a lot of engineering firms in the world, I think, is that it commits to doing long-term monitoring post-projects. This is in Baird's best interest, so they can design solutions that are effective. But it's also in the interest of Coastal Zone Management Authority and the citizenry of Barbados, because it means that we can truly see what's going on after these structures are built and how quickly nature recovers, or if there's a problem, we can monitor that and know that and fix it. Also, Barbados is unique because University of West Indies is there, and CERMES, and people like Hazel Oxenford, who have been doing long-term monitoring studies on the health of the reef and on different coastal ecosystems. So this is a unique case where there's a lot of knowledge that could be harnessed and a lot of interest and a lot of partnerships that set the stage for these kinds of solutions. Now, Mustique is completely different. Mustique is not densely developed. It is very sparsely inhabited by extremely wealthy people who really care about the ocean. But I would say, if it's fair to say, I think it may be that in Barbados, the beaches and the coastal ecosystems are more important to the Bajans than they are to the Mustique population. And I say that, I'll probably get in trouble for saying that. I know this is being recorded, so I don't know. But I say that because Mustique is a kind of resort island, or an island with private homes, where the entire island is very well managed, and where the entire environment is very important. So it's not just the beaches, it's and not just the coastal areas, but the whole of the landscape. It's also unique in that Mustique is a place where there's ample resources to do development right, and to monitor and research and do restoration. So Baird was called in again, this place, to fix again a beach erosion problem In this case, this is Lansikoy Bay, one of the biggest bays in Mystique, very important for local landowners. They'd put in a revetment along this entire bay. There's this revetment you can see. So basically hardening the shoreline for this entire bay. And I'm sure you all know that hardening the shoreline is never a good idea. They were subsequently very surprised when they lost the beach on the other side of the revetment. And so Baird was called in to fix that problem. And that problem was pretty easy fix, a couple of throw flume groins on the beach and a couple of submerged breakwaters. But the situation in Mystique, this was in 2009 when we went down to fix the beach. And I say we because I work part-time for Baird. So if you're wondering why I'm saying we, it's because I do work with this engineering firm. We went down and essentially fixed the problem, and landowners were happy, but there was something going on in the bay which was disturbing to us. And in one part of the bay, the breakwaters, there was still some erosion going on. I'll say the breakwaters didn't work because the breakwaters weren't there, but there was continued erosion going on, so it needed a little bit more of an investigation. And one of the things that we do is sand constituent analysis to understand what's the sand made of and where's the material coming from, so that we know what to do to enhance the production of that sand material. And in this case, like many Caribbean beaches, the sand is made primarily out of halimeda, which is a calcareous algae. And halimeda is this is the dead skeleton of halimeda. And this is made into sand by parrotfish that come and graze halimeda, primarily parrotfish. Some other grazers do this too. Parrotfish are wonderful sand producers. A single parrotfish will produce a ton of sand a year by excreting the sand out the other end. And so we know from the sand constituent analysis that this is halimeda is super important for Lansikoy Bay and for maintaining the beach. The other thing we knew about Lansikoy Bay was that it was historically an area of vast seagrass. Shallow water bay, vast seagrass, coral reefs on the far end, but mostly seagrass in the interior. And these are two images, one from 2005, the other from 2016, that show the loss of seagrass. And the loss of seagrass was initially from the desalination outfall. Mystique gets all of its fresh water from desal. The desalination outfall was originally right here, right on the beach. So it's dumping highly salinated brine into the water. And slowly all the seagrass in this area died out. In 2009, we noticed that, and we told the Mystique company to move that outfall offshore, which they did, but they only moved it to here. And so as a result, we had subsequent loss of seagrass at the outfall. So they have now moved that thing to where we said to move it originally, which was out into this deep channel. And that will hopefully help with the seagrass situation. And there's a picture of the dreaded outfall, and you can see the high salinity coming through. There are other confounding factors that I don't want to take up any more time with this example, except that there's a lagoon behind the Lansikoy Bay, which has mangroves in it. And the other thing that we are recommending is that that lagoon opening be kept open now, so that there's flushing of the lagoon waters into Lansikoy Bay and marine waters going back into the lagoon to keep the mangroves healthy and to have the mangroves do what they do, which is filter water from pollutants and also provide nursery habitat for fish. So this again is a work in progress. There is seagrass coming back. The shoreline is stabilized, but there's a lot of work yet to be done. So these two examples, again, not typical of situations all around the world. They kind of represent two ends of the spectrum. But they are both illustrating the fact that you have to understand the problem before you can do active restoration and get the system to the point healthy enough where nature can start to recover itself. Now, in all parts of the world, these problems are multifaceted and they require a multifaceted solution. So in every case, in Barbados' case, it's not enough that we stabilize the shoreline, obviously, or that we try and deal with localized water quality. If water quality is bad 100 meters away, that's going to be a problem. This is groundwater pollution as well as surface water pollution coming in, as well as pollution at sea. Barbados needs to deal with fisheries issues and illegal fishing. It needs to deal with areas, the health of areas offshore. It needs to deal with how it sites future development, where and how much can it accommodate, whether it can reintroduce mangrove into places that have lost mangrove and seagrass into places that have lost seagrass and so forth. So all of these things are multifaceted solution required. And I just want to give a shout out to a special issue that Lisa and I are working on of ocean sustainability that will showcase these kinds of multifaceted restoration projects at scale. It's an issue that's going to be coming out late this year, I think, if we manage. And you'll see examples where from places as diverse as the Solent here in the UK to places in the Western United States, Pacific Northwest, and Turkey in the Mediterranean and so forth. So keep an eye on that, and we'll let you know when that special issue is out. So this is the only way, this kind of multifaceted, complex solution to complex problems is the only way we can break this cycle and turn it around and make it a positive. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to then allow coastal systems to recover themselves. Now, the last thing I want to say, and then I'll take questions, happy to do that, is that there's a lot of pathways right now to sustained restoration. And by sustained restoration, I mean not just going in and fixing a problem, fixing a broken part of the reef or fixing a eroding beach, but sustained restoration where we have natural recovery happening organically and intrinsically in the system that it will continue. Those pathways include embedding restoration directly into marine spatial planning. That's a topic for another lecture, but marine spatial planning is happening all around the world. There is a directive in the European Union, so all countries have to do marine spatial planning that have marine areas. All around the world, countries are doing marine spatial planning at small scales, at national scales, and we need to embed restoration into that planning. But we also need to mainstream restoration into all kinds of development, as I mentioned before. We can take advantage of the BBNJ Agreement and the Global Biodiversity Framework to get restoration going all around the world and to get funds flowing to particularly developing countries to be able to do this restoration, to be able to invest in the science needed to understand what the problem is and to tailor the solution. We should utilize markets, a kind of the green capitalism idea, and look for private-public partnerships wherever possible to finance these interventions. We should engage those that benefit from restoration in underwriting restoration, including supporting the research post-restoration, the long-term research. And I should say in Barbados, the landowners have pooled their funds to be able to support this long-term monitoring with Baird to understand what's going on in many, many sites, not just the ones I mentioned. And the last thing is we should consider the unintended consequences of certain policies and always beware of easy answers. The answers aren't easy, but they're doable, and we are doing them, and we will need to do them further. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And this only works for Hillary term, but I just wanted to put it there in case you'd like to meet in person. I'd be happy to do that while I'm here until March 8th.
Great. Thank you, Tundi. So we can take some questions now. Just to, okay.
Tundi, where have we got to with carbon biodiversity credits for blue solutions?
Not where we'd like to be, Charlie. I mean, I think I should have known you were going to ask that question. I think we are at the stage where there's been a flurry of activity around blue carbon. There's been a lot of pushback from the conservation community and civil society about greenwashing and about offsetting carbon in general as a principle that allows for further carbon emissions. So just the general principle of markets and that kind of market failure, if you will. But that said, carbon markets are expanding, and more projects are coming online. For many years, for a decade ago, the problem wasn't the carbon market so much as the pipeline and the availability of projects to invest in. And despite Vera and other standard bearers that are have criteria for evaluating projects to be sure that the carbon credit is genuine and the investment is worth it effectively. There weren't enough projects to invest in. Biodiversity markets are something new. I know you're one of the pioneers, so maybe you should answer the question on what's going on with biodiversity markets. But biodiversity markets, not in offsetting biodiversity, but in investing in biodiversity as a business enterprise. So investing in biodiversity, knowing that biodiversity then pays back. An enhancement of biodiversity pays back. And one of the things that institutions like the World Bank are looking at is how can you couple biodiversity and blue carbon or any other kind of market mechanism so that you don't go down these kind of myopic avenues towards maximizing one service at the expense of others. And I'll tell you an example of what I mean. In Abu Dhabi is strangely a country that has the longest history of planting mangroves of any country in the world. You would never expect that in the Arabian Gulf, but that's the case. Abu Dhabi has been doing it forever. The founding sheikh was very fond of mangrove and created mangrove plantations all over. Abu Dhabi, the Department of Environment, Ajedi it's called, started doing mangrove planting for the purpose of blue carbon, of sequestering carbon over a decade ago. And they have these mangrove plantations. Unfortunately, those mangrove plantations are sequestering carbon, and they are able to demonstrate that carbon credits could be sold. Abu Dhabi doesn't need carbon credits, but they did it as a demonstration. But the problem is that you're using single species. They're planting these mangroves, one every 3 meters in these grids. And in many places, the plantations are not even connected to the sea. So they're not offering the service of fish nursery areas. They're not stabilizing the shoreline or filtering water from pollutants, but they are sequestering carbon. Now, and again, I'll probably get in trouble for that. So I apologize if I was telling that story, but again, so if we're maximizing one kind of credit at the expense of other credits, that is not a good path. And World Bank is now interested in finding ways to kind of mainstream blue biodiversity and get it in to things like the carbon facility, which funds carbon sequestration projects and that kind of thing. I think the worlds are coming together, and the markets are evolving as best they can with fits and starts and experimentation. And you can answer that question. Charlie Burrell, this is of NEP estate and of rewilding Britain.
Great,
and
thank
other
you.
things.
Thanks, Tundi. Thanks for taking us all to the Caribbean in your talk. I know you've been involved in other work kind of closer to home in the Solent. So Blue Marine Foundation is leading a large seascape scale restoration project down there. And I understand you've been there to see it. It's ongoing. But I wonder if you might say a little bit about what's exciting about the multi-habitat component in that particular project, and reflect on some of the lessons learned and how that might connect with some of the aspirations you noted here on the need to really follow from terrestrial landscape scale restoration, and to see that in the sea as well.
Yeah, so thanks for asking the question. And what I didn't mention is the kind of underlying paradigm to all these multifaceted complex solutions to complex problems is the idea of ecosystem-based management, that these ecosystems are all interlinked, and that understanding those linkages is critical to maintaining their health and productivity and biodiversity and so forth. So in the Solent, they have a multifaceted program. I don't have anything to do with the execution of the Solent or the design of the Solent or anything. Charlie and I both sit on oversight panel for the Endangered Landscapes program, which is based in Cambridge out of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. And that program funded the Solent project alongside other funding the Blue Marine Foundation and others have gotten. But it's a very large scale project that involves a number of different activities, physically rebuilding the salt marsh. And this picture actually way back in the beginning, well, I don't know, is from the Solent. So they're rebuilding salt marsh, they're restoring seagrass, and with the salt marsh is actually physically rebuilding, planting, and physically putting in buffers and barriers to retain the soil until the salt marsh takes hold. For the seagrass, it's more of a kind of passive restoration, a bit of planting and seeding. And then they're also doing active, here we go. No. They're also doing active oyster reef restoration. So they are building reefs, oyster reefs, actually in some of the estuaries in order, I don't know where it is. Never mind. Take my word for it anyway. And so they're actively dealing with the oyster reefs. But that said, so those are, akin to other things that other people are doing all over the world, harnessing other kinds of tools to do restoration. But one of the things that they're doing is the Solent is probably the most heavily used body of water in the UK. And, it's an area of a lot of shipping and recreational use, all kinds of uses, an urbanized environment on land. And one of the things that they're looking at is water coming into the system from rivers and what can be done to improve the water quality. Also, all kinds of things about what can be done to enhance environmental education related to the project, and how people can better understand what's going on in the Solent and better support it and be better stewards, including not just individual citizens, but also companies that operate in the Solent, and then can finance future restoration. And I encourage you to go to the website. to look at two films that were put together for the project. Very, very compelling, no, thanks. Very compelling stories being told, and they just blew me away in terms of the production value of these short videos that really talk about the restoration and what is going to be required in terms of time frame to really see the outcomes. And it's very inspiring. So thanks for mentioning it. And it is the ecosystem-based management idea is the thing that underlies that.
Thank you very much for your talk. I wanted to know in the case study, particularly for Barbados, it seems more relevant. It strikes me that by increasing and enhancing the amount of beach available, whilst you've obviously outlined the benefits for the natural environment, there's a risk that actually you could end up increasing the human pressure in that environment, for example, through increased tourism or increased human use. And there's no sort of safeguards or guarantees that show that increased human use will be at a sustainable level. So how do you guarantee that you find a sustainable human use balance for the new ecosystem that is created? Because I just have this thing in the back of my mind that often with these restoration projects, it depends who's paid for those restoration projects. And if the people paying for it are paying primarily to protect the beach for tourism use, then tourism is the maximized sort of output as opposed to nature. You alluded to that with the Abu Dhabi sort of comparison. So how does that work for the Barbados case study?
Yeah, really good question. And I don't disagree with you that creating especially new habitat for the elites is not something that's sustainable, and certainly not something that's just. But in this case, so I should have explained a little bit better. That beach, especially in both the whole town and the Haywoods Beach, in fact, the entire West Coast was always intact and always available for local residents. And the loss of the beach, I think, affected local residents almost more than the tourists. There are many secluded, quite nice resorts in Barbados that still have their beach intact and have a lot of man-made structures and have a highly artificialized, I mean, even this was artificialized. I mean, it's something that affects me a little bit emotionally when I see this, because, you know, I would much prefer a wild coast and not to see man-made structures at all. But there are, you know, tourist beaches available only to paying tourists in Barbados. But this West Coast has always been open access for residents, and it was residents that were getting squeezed by the beach erosion. So bringing the beach back, you know, gives them back the access to beach areas. It also, the development behind the beach has committed to educating their tourists that are coming through in the resort. And, you know, that will hopefully make some difference. But Barbados is really special because it is so highly developed that, and there is really no choice but to find these solutions for the entire coastline in Barbados, because if not, Barbados will be inundated and the reefs will all die off. The remaining reefs, which are not in good health, they will all die off if there's constant inundation and constant pollution coming back from the land. So Barbados really doesn't have a choice. And I didn't want to make this sound like it was a typical example, because if you look anywhere else in the Antilles, you have the situation that you're talking about. You have areas that you could do conservation very effectively. You could put in a marine park. You could give special access to residents and exclude tourists from areas to make it more just, and to allow natural recovery without these kind of heavy-handed engineering solutions. But Barbados and many other places actually in the world do need this kind of thing, and the choices are few and far between on what you can do. A great question. I know if some of you want to escape and get to the drinks.
That was great. Thank you very much. I was wondering, because you said you put in a stormwater drain in the Barbados one, correct? I was just wondering, how far upstream do you go when you're starting the process of determining what the right thing to do is in those situations? Because I know that in the UK, one of the ways that they're looking at reducing flooding is by damming more upstream, or even the reintroduction of beavers. And in a place like Barbados, obviously that doesn't happen, but equally, it's far more densely populated as you get close to the shore. So I'm wondering how far back up you go, but also how you might mitigate some of the effects downstream if you go upstream.
Yeah, there are projects more to this on the south coast that deal with entire catchments and are trying to regulate some of the water flows from high up in the catchment. That's not possible on the west coast. The drop is very precipitous, and these rainfall events are very sudden and extreme rainfall events. So it's not like the constant flow of these creeks are almost dry in the dry season. And in the wet season, it's just, there's nothing you could do. There's nothing you could do to prevent the water from coming down. Or nothing you would want to do, actually, because you would completely transform the creek and gorge landscape. But on the bottom, the building of culverts that allow water to come through, not like the fluidizer. I'm talking about bigger culverts that are go under the road, for instance, and under some of the infrastructure, and which trap large debris and that kind of thing, so it doesn't get out to sea. But you raise an interesting question, and I'm going to make a kind of controversial point here. In some cases, it's actually better to not modulate the water flow and to let it come out in a big stream. And this is something that the fluidizer does. The fluidizer filters the water before it reaches the ocean, but the water comes out. It's not damming the water somewhere and keeping it in a reservoir. It's letting the water out to sea. If it comes out in a big rush, it actually goes far offshore in the surface waters, and it never affects the reef. If you take the same amount of polluted water and you let it come out slowly over time, it sinks down and it goes and it affects the reef. So as much as people hate to see the very turbid plume of water during these rainfall events, what we know is that water is going fast and quick out to sea and not affecting the near shore as much. So in that sense, we would want to be careful about modulating the flow, because you wouldn't want to set up the situation where you had this kind of chronic pollution affecting the reefs all the time, unless you could filter it in every culvert along the coast, which
Thank you.
We'll do one more question here, and then I have one online.
Thanks very much. That was a great talk. I'm just wondering about these green-gray infrastructure approaches. What kind of uncertainties are there around that and scaling that, and what kind of things are you looking for in the monitoring that goes on afterwards?
Yeah, so the scaling question is very important one, and these things are done on a small site-by-site basis. Recognize, but the engineers, and it's not just Baird, and I know I sound like I'm a mouthpiece for the company, but there are many environmental engineering and coastal engineering firms that are doing this kind of work and doing it well. They do always model the effect on adjacent areas to be sure that you're not, for instance, robbing sediment from one area and bringing it, stabilizing your shoreline there and causing impacts on the other side. So even though the scaling is quite localized, small scale, it's still taking it, into account the wider picture of what's going on. But not everything can be controlled by any entity, even by the coastal zone management unit. And so there are things like breaches of setbacks, which happen all the time everywhere, even in like police states. People will always breach the rules and try to get their homes or infrastructure closer to the water. And so you see that happening, for instance, which then impacts even the best designed projects and can affect their efficiency and effectiveness. In terms of monitoring, what Baird is doing with the help of these landowners that help finance this, and is first of all creating a data set that they then hand over to the Coastal Zone Management Unit, but collecting data in such a way that they know it will be carried forward by the Coastal Zone Management Unit. So none of this very expensive stuff of building physical models and, doing that, or using very expensive sensors to check everything as we would do when we're going into a site to better understand it, but rather just monitoring the basics. So monitoring turbidity with Secchi discs or turbidity meters, salinity, temperature, doing very simple agra biodiversity assessments. So looking at coral reef organisms and looking at fish populations and doing those censuses twice a year. So not more. Knowing that whatever monitoring systems is in place is only going to be carried forward if it's simple enough and not so costly that the Coastal Zone Management Unit can afford to do it. And most of these projects are monitored for 4 years following the project finishing, and some for longer.
Thank you.
And the other things I should mention that they monitor is use of the resources. So also sociological studies. And I really didn't talk much about the human element, and I apologize because that's actually something I'd prefer to talk about than this. But understanding how people are using the rebuilt beaches or the improved water in the coastal area, how many snorkelers are going, and trying to understand that.
Okay, we've got one more question online here. Let's see. So you mentioned that we must foster interdisciplinary connections and collaborations to solve these complex issues. So the question is, how do you think we can facilitate these interdisciplinary relationships and allow more opportunities for designers or artists to get involved? So for context, the person asking the question is an architect and designer with a background in biology.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Well, artists to get involved, it reminds me of the talk yesterday. And and I apologize for my presentation, which was so unartistic and terrible. And my communication skills also are not that good. But so to get artists involved is absolutely critical. And it's a component of, so when we talk about when I say multidisciplinary, I mean trying to harness the natural sciences, the social sciences, the political sciences, so particularly, but also psychology and really understanding what human perceptions are, and understanding how to affect behavior or set the stage for good behavior. Let's call it good behavior. To get away from a world where we're constantly enforcing regulations, but we're looking for a world in which there's compliance, and that's coming from within as opposed to being imposed on people. And part of that, so part of the perception piece and part of understanding how to affect behavior is to communicate in different ways. And as we heard yesterday, science communication can only go so far, and showing graphs is fine and good for this audience, but not for the general public. And so being able to work with artists and other artists of all types, so graphic artists, as well as poets and writers and so forth. And Isabella is here, Isabella Tree, one of the most prolific writers on rewilding and on nature. So that's extremely important. And I should mention that the Endangered Landscapes program in Cambridge does fund the artists in residence program with the restoration projects that they fund. So they open for proposals on many of the projects, and those projects work with the restoration teams to design art projects that can either communicate the restoration project or can help forge closer links between communities and the environments that they live in. So really important piece. And yeah, thanks.
Great. And just concluding and picking up on that point, we have a comment from the Solent project lead who shared online the YouTube link. If anyone wants to learn more about that.
Oh, please, I encourage you
seascape
to look at
restoration
these
project a little
videos
closer to
and visit
home.
the website. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah,
Really good.
great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.